Right now, in the space behind your eyes, something is happening that no equation has ever fully explained. You are experiencing this sentence, not just processing it, a string of black shapes converting into electrical signals, converting into meaning, but experiencing it. There is a felt quality to reading these words right now, a quiet hum of awareness that makes this moment yours and no one else's. And here is the strange part. Nobody, not a single scientist alive, can tell you why that felt quality exists at all. You could build a machine that does everything your brain does. It could take in light, convert it to signals, store memories, produce speech, even claim to feel things. And it could do every bit of that without a flicker of inner experience. Nothing it would be like to be that machine. No warmth behind the words. Just information going in and information coming out. So why aren't you that machine? That question has a name in philosophy of science. It's called the hard problem of consciousness, and it has sat, mostly unsolved, at the center of neuroscience for as long as neuroscience has existed. And in the last few decades, a small number of serious physicists, not mystics, not charlatans, actual Nobel-level scientists, have looked at that unsolved problem and asked something that sounds almost heretical. What if the answer isn't in biology at all? What if it's hiding in the strangest, least intuitive branch of physics we have, quantum mechanics? Tonight we're going to sit with that question, slowly, carefully. We're going to look at where it came from, who proposed it, why most of the scientific establishment thinks it's wrong, and why, even so, the debate refuses to die. I want to be honest with you before we start. This is one of the most contested ideas in modern science. For every physicist who takes it seriously, there are 10 who consider it a beautiful mistake. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, and I'm not going to dress up speculation as settled fact. But I promise you this. By the end of tonight, you'll understand exactly why this question is so hard to let go of, even for people who don't believe the answer is quantum at all. Let's start at the beginning. Not with quantum mechanics, with something much simpler, the color red. Picture a ripe tomato, bright, saturated red, sitting on a countertop in afternoon light. Now think about what happens between the moment light bounces off that tomato and the moment you consciously perceive its color. Photons hit your retina. Specialized cells called cones absorb specific wavelengths and convert that absorption into electrical impulses. Those impulses travel along the optic nerve, cross at the optic chiasm, arrive at the visual cortex at the back of your skull, and get processed through a cascade of specialized regions that extract edges, motion, color, and form. Eventually, that information gets integrated into what you experience as seeing a red tomato. Every step of that process can be measured, mapped, and explained using ordinary physics and chemistry. Nothing mysterious about photon absorption. Nothing mysterious about electrical impulses traveling along a nerve fiber. Nothing mysterious, even, about neurons in the visual cortex responding preferentially to red wavelengths over green ones. But somewhere in that chain, something happens that no purely physical description captures. The redness itself. The specific, private felt quality of seeing red rather than green. Philosophers call this quality qualia, the subjective, first-person character of experience. And here's the uncomfortable truth. You can describe every neuron, every electrical signal, every chemical gradient involved in seeing red in exhaustive scientific detail and never once explain why any of it should feel like anything at all. This is not a small gap in our knowledge, the kind we might close with a few more decades of neuroscience. It's a different kind of gap entirely. Neuroscientist and philosopher David Chalmers, who coined the term the hard problem in 1995, drew a sharp distinction between two very different kinds of questions about the mind. The easy problems of consciousness, and they're only easy by comparison, involve explaining cognitive functions. How does the brain discriminate between stimuli? How does it integrate information across different senses? How does it produce reports about its own internal states? These are hard technical problems, but they're the kind of problems science is built to solve. You can imagine, in principle, a complete wiring diagram that accounts for every one of them. The hard problem is different. It's not asking how the brain processes information. It's asking why any of that processing is accompanied by experience at all. Why isn't all of that sophisticated computation happening in the dark, the way it happens inside your laptop right now? Your laptop discriminates between different pixel values on your screen. It integrates data from multiple sources. It can even, in a very limited sense, report on its own internal states through error messages and diagnostics. Nobody thinks your laptop is having an experience while it does any of that. So, what's different about you? This is the question that has quietly haunted neuroscience for a century. And it's worth sitting with, because it's the reason this whole quantum consciousness debate exists in the first place. If consciousness was simply what happens when enough information gets integrated in a complex enough system, then, in principle, sufficiently advanced artificial intelligence should eventually become conscious too, purely as a side effect of computational complexity. Many researchers do believe exactly that, but others look at decades of increasingly sophisticated AI, systems that can hold fluent conversations, write essays, solve advanced mathematics, and notice something troubling. None of it, as far as we can tell, has budged us any closer to understanding why there's something it's like to be a conscious system rather than nothing. That gap is where quantum consciousness theory tries to live. Now, before we go any further, I want to slow down on quantum mechanics itself, because the theory means something very specific in physics, and it's worth understanding correctly before we ask whether it has anything to do with your mind at all. At the scale of everyday objects, baseballs, planets, people, the universe behaves according to rules that feel intuitive. Objects have definite locations. They move along predictable paths. If you know where something is now and how fast it's moving, you can calculate exactly where it will be later. This is the physics of Isaac Newton, and it works beautifully for almost everything you'll ever interact with directly. But at the scale of atoms and subatomic particles, this intuitive picture falls apart entirely. Particles like electrons don't behave like tiny billiard balls with definite positions. Instead, before you measure them, they exist in what's called a superposition, a mathematical description that assigns probabilities to multiple possible states simultaneously. An electron isn't really spinning clockwise or counterclockwise before you check. It exists in a blended state of both possibilities, described by something called a wave function, until the act of measurement forces it into one definite outcome. This isn't a metaphor, and it isn't a gap in our knowledge that better instruments will eventually close. It has been confirmed in extraordinary and repeated detail by nearly a century of experiments. The famous double-slit experiment shows particles behaving like interference patterns, as if each one explores multiple paths at once until you try to observe which path it actually took, at which point the interference vanishes and the particles start behaving like ordinary, localized objects again. Quantum mechanics is, by a wide margin, the most rigorously tested theory in the history of science. Every prediction it has made, down to mind-bending levels of precision, has held up. There's also a phenomenon called entanglement, which Einstein himself found so troubling, he called it spooky action at a distance. Under the right conditions, two particles can become linked in such a way that measuring the state of one instantly correlates with the state of the other, no matter how far apart they are. Not through any signal traveling between them, the correlation is instantaneous, defying our ordinary sense of cause and effect, unfolding across space. Einstein spent years trying to prove entanglement couldn't really work this way. Experiments in the decades since have shown again and again that it does. So quantum mechanics is real. It's not mysticism. It's arguably the best confirmed theory human beings have ever produced, and it underlies almost every piece of modern technology you use, from the transistors in your phone to the lasers in a supermarket scanner. But here's the question that matters for tonight. For most of the 20th century, physicists assumed that quantum effects like superposition and entanglement were confined to the extremely small and the extremely cold. The reasoning went like this. Quantum states are famously fragile. The moment a quantum system interacts with its noisy, warm, chaotic surroundings, a process called decoherence, its delicate superposition collapses almost instantly into ordinary classical behavior. That's why we don't see baseballs existing in two places at once. Baseballs are made of trillions of particles constantly interacting with air molecules, light, and heat, and any quantum weirdness at that scale gets washed out in a fraction of a second. The human brain, by this reasoning, should be the worst possible environment for quantum effects to survive. It operates at a warm 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. It's soaked in fluid. It's an unbelievably noisy, chaotic, wet environment, packed with constant chemical and electrical activity. If quantum coherence collapses almost instantly in cold, carefully isolated laboratory conditions, how could it possibly persist for even a moment inside something as biologically messy as a living brain? This was, for decades, considered close to a knockout argument against any theory connecting quantum mechanics to consciousness. And it's still the single strongest scientific objection to everything we're about to explore. I want you to hold on to it, because we're going to come back to it directly, with real numbers, in a later part of this story. But in 1989, a mathematical physicist far too respected to be dismissed as a crank decided the argument wasn't as airtight as everyone assumed. His name was Roger Penrose, and before he ever said a word about consciousness, he had already reshaped how physicists think about black holes, space-time, and the mathematics of the universe itself. In 2020, he would go on to win the Nobel Prize in Physics for work completely unrelated to any of this, proving, using pure mathematics, that black holes are an inevitable consequence of Einstein's general relativity. This is not a fringe figure. This is one of the most respected theoretical physicists of the last 100 years. And in a book called The Emperor's New Mind, Penrose made an argument that stunned much of the scientific community. He proposed that human consciousness, and specifically human mathematical understanding, could not be fully explained by any classical computational process, no matter how sophisticated. His argument drew on a famous result in mathematical logic called Gödel's Incompleteness theorem, which shows that in any sufficiently powerful formal system, there will always be true statements that the system itself cannot prove. Penrose argued that human mathematicians can somehow recognize the truth of certain statements, that no formal, rule-following computational system could ever prove from within its own rules. If that's right, he reasoned, then whatever is happening in the human mind when we grasp mathematical truth can't simply be a very complicated version of what a classical computer does. Something else has to be going on. This is a genuinely controversial claim, and I want to pause here rather than rush past it, because a great deal of the criticism of quantum consciousness theory begins right at this starting point, before microtubules or anesthesia or any of it ever enters the picture. Many logicians and computer scientists have argued that Penrose's use of Gödel's theorem doesn't hold up, that human mathematicians are just as bound by the limits of formal systems as any computer. We simply don't notice our own errors and inconsistencies the way a machine forces us to confront them. This objection has never been fully resolved to the satisfaction of either side, and it's worth knowing it exists, because it means the entire foundation of the theory we're about to explore was disputed from the very first page. But Penrose, held his ground. If classical computation truly can't explain consciousness, he argued, then consciousness must be doing something non-computational, something outside the rules of ordinary step-by-step processing. And there is exactly one place in known physics where genuinely non-deterministic, non-classical behavior shows up. The quantum realm, in the moment a superposition collapses into a single definite outcome. Penrose wasn't a neuroscientist, though. He didn't know where in the brain such a process might actually take place, or how biological tissue could possibly protect anything so delicate from the chaos of a living, breathing body. For that piece of the puzzle, he would need someone who understood the brain from the inside. Someone who had spent an entire career watching consciousness switch on and off in real human patients, under carefully controlled conditions, every single day. That person was an anesthesiologist named Stuart Hameroff, and the moment their two very different worlds collided, a mathematical physicist obsessed with the limits of computation, and a physician who had spent decades turning consciousness on and off with a needle, is where our story really begins. We'll pick up exactly there. Stuart Hameroff had a job that, more than almost any other in medicine, put him face to face with the mystery of consciousness every single working day. As an anesthesiologist, his entire professional life revolved around one deceptively simple task: making a person's awareness disappear, safely, reliably, and then bringing it back again a few hours later as though nothing had happened. If you've ever had surgery, you've experienced this yourself. One moment you're counting backward from 10, aware, present, yourself. The next moment, subjectively, with no felt gap at all, you're waking up in a recovery room, hours having vanished without a trace. Not like sleep, where you often have some sense of time passing, some fragments of dream. Under general anesthesia, there is, for most people, simply nothing. A clean absence. And then you're back. Hameroff found this transition genuinely strange, in a way that most of his colleagues had stopped noticing, because it had become routine. Medicine can tell you a great deal about what anesthetic drugs do at the molecular level, which receptors they bind to, which ion channels they affect, how they change the electrical firing patterns of neurons. What medicine could not tell him, and still largely cannot tell anyone, is why those molecular changes are accompanied by the complete disappearance of subjective experience. You can map every biochemical event of anesthesia in exhaustive detail and still be left with the same hard problem we talked about earlier, just wearing a different coat. Hameroff had also spent years studying a particular structure inside cells that most people, even most scientists, rarely think about: microtubules. Microtubules are tiny, hollow, cylindrical protein structures found inside essentially every cell in your body, including neurons. If you picture a cell's internal skeleton, microtubules are a major part of it. They help cells hold their shape. They act as tracks along which other molecules get transported from one part of the cell to another, and they play a crucial role in cell division. They're built from a protein called tubulin, and they're astonishingly small, roughly 25 nanometers across, thousands of times thinner than a human hair. For most of the 20th century, microtubules were understood purely as structural and logistical machinery, the scaffolding and the shipping infrastructure of the cell. Useful, essential even, but not exactly the kind of thing anyone associated with the mystery of the mind. Hameroff saw something different. He had spent time studying how microtubules were organized, and he became fascinated by their geometric structure. Tubulin proteins are arranged in a very specific lattice pattern, and Hameroff began to wonder whether that structure might allow microtubules to do more than provide mechanical support, whether they might be capable of processing information in some more sophisticated way than anyone had previously considered. When Hameroff came across Penrose's book and its argument that consciousness required some non-computational quantum mechanical process, something clicked into place for him. Penrose had the physics, but no biological mechanism. Hameroff had spent years staring at a structure inside every neuron in the human brain that he already suspected might be doing more than the textbooks gave it credit for. The two of them began collaborating, and in the early 1990s, they published a theory that would become one of the most famous and most fiercely contested ideas in the science of consciousness. They called it Orchestrated Objective Reduction, Orch-OR for short. Here is the core of what they proposed, as plainly as I can lay it out. Penrose and Hameroff argued that microtubules inside neurons are capable of sustaining quantum superpositions, that the tubulin proteins making up their walls could exist briefly in a blended quantum state of multiple possible configurations at once, rather than a single, definite classical state. According to their theory, this quantum superposition would build up across networks of microtubules, connected across many neurons simultaneously, until it reached a specific physical threshold. At that threshold, the superposition would undergo what Penrose called objective reduction, a spontaneous collapse into one definite state, occurring not because of external observation in the way traditional quantum mechanics describes measurement, but because of an inherent instability built into the structure of spacetime itself once a quantum superposition becomes large enough. This is the part of the theory that is uniquely Penrose's, and it's worth understanding because it separates Orch-OR from run-of-the-mill quantum mysticism. In standard interpretations of quantum mechanics, wave function collapse is triggered by measurement or interaction with the environment. Decoherence, the very process we talked about that makes quantum effects vanish almost instantly in warm, noisy systems. Penrose proposed something more radical and more specifically his own, that gravity itself, operating through general relativity, places an objective limit on how large or complex a quantum superposition can become before it spontaneously collapses on its own, independent of any observer or environmental interaction at all. This is sometimes called gravitationally induced collapse, and it remains on its own a serious if unproven idea within theoretical physics, being explored by researchers with no interest whatsoever in consciousness. Penrose and Hameroff proposed that each one of these spontaneous collapse events, happening inside orchestrated networks of microtubules throughout the brain, corresponds to a single, discrete moment of conscious experience. Something like a single frame in a film occurring roughly 40 times per second, according to their original estimates, stitching together into what feels to you like the smooth, continuous stream of your own awareness. If this is true, they argued, it would explain something classical neuroscience has always struggled with, the so-called binding problem. Your brain processes color, shape, sound, and meaning in physically separate regions, using separate neural pathways, and yet you don't experience the world as a disconnected bundle of fragments. You experience a single, unified scene. The tomato is red and round and sitting on the counter, all at once, bound together into one coherent moment of awareness. Orch-OR proposed that quantum coherence spreading across microtubule networks throughout the brain could provide a physical mechanism for that unity, in a way that classical, purely electrical neuron-to-neuron signaling has never fully explained. And here is where Hameroff's clinical experience folded directly back into the theory. If consciousness really does depend on quantum processes happening inside microtubules, then anesthetic drugs, which reliably and reversibly switch off consciousness, ought to be interfering with those quantum processes rather than, or in addition to, their known classical effects on neuron firing. Hameroff pointed to research showing that many general anesthetics, including some, like certain noble gases, that don't bind strongly to any of the usual neurotransmitter receptors, appear to act on the interior structure of proteins in a way that could plausibly disrupt delicate quantum states inside microtubules specifically. When the theory was first published, it landed like a depth charge in the scientific community. Here was one of the most respected physicists alive, teaming up with a working physician, making a serious, peer-reviewed argument that human consciousness might depend on quantum gravity effects occurring inside structural proteins in every neuron in your brain. It was ambitious almost beyond words. It connected general relativity, quantum measurement, cellular biology, and the deepest unsolved question in the philosophy of mind into a single, unified proposal. And the response from the rest of the scientific community was, for the most part, swift, skeptical, and severe. The central objection came almost immediately, and it came from exactly the place we flagged earlier: decoherence. If quantum superpositions collapse in a tiny fraction of a second the moment they interact with a warm, chaotic environment, how could anything resembling a stable quantum state possibly survive long enough inside the wet, hot, endlessly jostling interior of a living neuron to do anything relevant to conscious experience at all? This wasn't a vague handwave of an objection. It was about to become a very precise, very public, very devastating piece of mathematics. And the physicist who delivered it would become, for the next 2 decades, Orch-OR's most formidable critic. We'll meet him next, and we'll go through his calculation in detail, because it's the single most important scientific challenge this entire theory has ever faced. And understanding it properly is the only way to understand how the debate actually stands today. And yet, and this is the part of the story that keeps this debate alive rather than letting it quietly die, something happened in a completely different corner of science around the same time. Something that would force physicists to reconsider one of their most basic assumptions about biology and quantum mechanics. It didn't happen in neuroscience. It didn't happen in a brain at all. It happened in a leaf. For most of the 20th century, physicists assumed, reasonably, that quantum coherence simply could not survive in any biological system. Full stop. Because biological systems are warm, wet, and chemically chaotic. Exactly the conditions Tegmark's calculation described. This assumption wasn't limited to arguments about the brain. It was a general principle applied to biology as a whole. Then, starting in the mid-2000s, a series of experiments on photosynthesis began to complicate that picture in a way almost nobody had anticipated. Photosynthesis begins when a photon of sunlight strikes a light-harvesting protein complex inside a plant, algae, or certain bacteria. That energy then needs to travel extremely efficiently to a specific molecular structure called the reaction center, where it gets converted into a form the organism can actually use. For decades, biologists assumed this energy transfer happened through a relatively simple, classical, essentially random hopping process. Energy bouncing from one molecule to the next, somewhat like a ball bouncing down a set of stairs, eventually finding its way to the bottom. In 2007, a team led by physical chemist Graham Fleming at the University of California, Berkeley, published a landmark study in the journal Nature using an advanced technique called two-dimensional electronic spectroscopy to study energy transfer in a photosynthetic protein complex from green sulfur bacteria, cooled to cryogenic temperatures. What they found surprised the field. The energy transfer showed clear signatures of quantum coherence, oscillating wave-like patterns consistent with the energy exploring multiple possible pathways simultaneously, rather than simply hopping randomly from site to site, and doing so on a timescale far longer than anyone had expected biology to sustain such delicate quantum behavior. This was, at first, observed only at extremely cold temperatures, and skeptics reasonably pointed out that cryogenic conditions are about as far from a living, warm-blooded brain as you can get. But the finding didn't stop there. In the years that followed, further research, including a widely discussed 2010 study led by Fleming's group and a separate 2010 study on marine algae, published by a team including Elisabetta Collini and Gregory Scholes, found evidence of similar long-lived quantum coherence effects in photosynthetic light harvesting complexes at physiological room temperature conditions. Not the deep cold of a laboratory cryostat, but temperatures close to what a living organism actually experiences. This mattered enormously because it meant the old blanket assumption that biology is simply too warm and too noisy for functionally relevant quantum coherence to survive ever, anywhere, was not quite as airtight as physicists had believed. Evolution, it turned out, may have found ways to structurally protect and even exploit quantum coherence for a specific biological function under real, physiologically relevant conditions in at least one well-documented system. I want to be very careful here, because this is exactly the point in the story where a lot of popular science content quietly starts to overreach, and I don't want to do that to you. The photosynthesis findings do not prove or even directly suggest that Orch-OR is correct. Photosynthetic quantum coherence involves a completely different physical system. Small, specifically structured pigment protein complexes optimized by evolution for one narrow purpose: shuttling energy a very short distance as efficiently as possible. It says nothing directly about whether structurally different proteins, like the tubulin in microtubules, arranged differently, serving different functions, embedded in the vastly more complex and chaotic environment of a living neuron, can sustain coherence on the much longer timescales, milliseconds, not femtoseconds, that Orch-OR requires for its theory of consciousness to work. What the photosynthesis research does responsibly establish is this: the sweeping, general argument that biology is definitionally too warm and wet for quantum coherence, full stop, turned out to be an overstatement. It's not automatically true everywhere in biology, in every system, under every condition. That doesn't rescue Orch-OR from Tegmark's specific targeted calculation about microtubules, but it does mean that dismissing quantum consciousness theory purely on the grounds that warm biological systems can't sustain quantum coherence, period, is now a weaker argument than it was in 2000, because we have direct experimental evidence that in at least some biological systems, under some conditions, they can. This is genuinely where mainstream science stands today, and it's a more interesting, more honest position than either side of the popular debate usually presents. Quantum biology, as a legitimate field, is real, growing, and increasingly well-funded. Researchers have gone on to find plausible evidence of quantum effects in other biological processes too, including the magnetic compass sense used by migratory birds, believed to rely on a quantum mechanism involving light-sensitive proteins called cryptochromes in the retina, and quantum tunneling effects that appear to play a role in how certain enzymes catalyze biochemical reactions far faster than classical chemistry alone would predict. None of this proves that consciousness is a quantum phenomenon. What it does is remove one of the objections that used to be treated as an automatic blanket disqualifier for any theory in this space. The debate that remains isn't, can biology ever sustain relevant quantum coherence? The evidence increasingly says, in specific cases, yes, it can. The debate that remains is much narrower and much harder to settle. Can the specific structures inside neurons, under the specific conditions inside a living human brain, sustain coherence long enough and in a way that's actually functionally connected to conscious experience, rather than simply being an interesting side effect of protein chemistry with no bearing on the mind at all? That is the question researchers on both sides of this debate are still, right now, in laboratories around the world, trying to actually answer. And in our next section, we're going to look at what some of them have found when they've gone looking directly inside microtubules themselves. Not photosynthetic proteins, not bird retinas, but the exact structures Penrose and Hameroff pointed to more than 30 years ago. And at the anesthesia research that first got Hameroff thinking about any of this in the first place. If Orch-OR was going to be more than a beautiful mathematical argument bolted onto a biological hunch, it needed something more than photosynthesis research happening in an entirely different kind of molecule. It needed evidence from the actual structure Penrose and Hameroff had staked their theory on, microtubules themselves, and it needed to explain the phenomenon that had started Hameroff down this road in the first place. The strange, clean, reversible disappearance of consciousness under general anesthesia. Let's go back to anesthesia for a moment, because it's genuinely one of the more interesting and underappreciated puzzles in medicine, and you don't need to accept anything about quantum mechanics to find it strange. For more than a century, doctors have been able to reliably switch consciousness off and on using a surprisingly diverse chemical toolkit. Some anesthetics, like propofol, work by binding to specific receptors in the brain, enhancing the effect of an inhibitory neurotransmitter called GABA, which calms neural activity down until consciousness fades. That story is well understood, at least at the level of receptor chemistry, and it fits comfortably within a purely classical picture of how neurons communicate. But there's a second category of anesthetics that has always been harder to explain, and it's the one Hameroff found most interesting. Noble gases, chemically inert elements like xenon, can also induce full surgical anesthesia, reliably switching off consciousness, despite the fact that xenon doesn't bind strongly to any of the receptor systems that explain how drugs like propofol work. Xenon is chemically almost entirely unreactive. It doesn't hook onto specific receptor sites the way conventional anesthetic drugs do. And yet, at the right concentration, it will reliably and reversibly eliminate consciousness in a human being, just as effectively as drugs with well-mapped receptor mechanisms. This has been a genuinely unresolved puzzle in anesthesiology for decades, independent of anything to do with quantum consciousness theory. If xenon isn't binding to the usual suspects, what exactly is it doing inside the brain that produces the same end result? The clean disappearance of awareness? Some conventional explanations point to weak interactions with certain ion channels and other protein structures throughout the nervous system, and mainstream anesthesiology research has continued to investigate these classical mechanisms directly, without any reference to quantum effects at all. This remains an active, ongoing area of research within standard pharmacology, not a mystery that requires quantum mechanics to solve. Hameroff, however, argued that this puzzle fit naturally with his theory. If microtubules really were central to generating conscious experience, he reasoned, then anesthetics that disrupt consciousness, even ones like xenon that don't act through conventional receptor binding, might be doing so by physically interfering with delicate structural or electronic properties inside microtubules, rather than, or in addition to, the effects on membrane receptors that mainstream pharmacology already documents. This is a genuinely testable idea, at least in principle, and over the years a small number of research groups have tried to test pieces of it directly. One line of research that Hameroff and his collaborators have pointed to repeatedly involves a set of experiments led by physicist Anirban Bandyopadhyay at the National Institute for Materials Science in Japan. Bandyopadhyay's team has published work studying the electronic and vibrational properties of microtubules extracted and purified in laboratory conditions using techniques that measure how these structures respond to applied electric fields. Their published results describe detecting resonant electronic oscillations within microtubule structures, and in some of that published work, the researchers have described observing changes in these signals when the microtubules were exposed to anesthetic compounds, compared to control conditions without anesthetic present. I want to be precise and careful about how to characterize this research, because it sits at exactly the point where popular science content usually starts to overstate things, and I don't want to do that. This work has been published in peer-reviewed physics and materials science journals, and it does show interesting, measurable electronic behavior in microtubules that goes beyond what was previously assumed about these structures. That's a real and worthwhile finding on its own, regardless of what it does or doesn't say about consciousness. What it does not do, and what even its own authors have generally been careful not to claim, is definitively demonstrate that this electronic activity constitutes the kind of large-scale, coherent quantum superposition that Penrose and Hameroff's theory requires, or that it's causally responsible for conscious experience, rather than simply being an interesting, previously undocumented electrical property of an isolated protein structure sitting in a lab dish. Detecting unexpected electronical signals in a purified structure outside a living cell is a genuinely different and much smaller claim than detecting quantum coherence that plays a causal role in the conscious experience of an intact, living brain. The gap between those two things is enormous, and it remains, as of today, unclosed. Separately, and worth mentioning because it illustrates just how much scientific effort has gone into testing pieces of this theory, even by researchers who don't fully accept it, other laboratories have investigated whether stabilizing microtubules with certain drugs changes an organism's sensitivity to anesthesia. The logic being that if microtubules really matter for consciousness, chemically reinforcing their structure should make it harder to knock consciousness out. Published research, including studies involving the microtubule stabilizing compound epothalone, has reported that pre-treating animals with microtubule stabilizing drugs before administering anesthesia can shift the amount of anesthetic needed to produce unconsciousness, compared to untreated controls. This finding has been cited by Orch-OR proponents as supportive evidence, since it suggests some genuine, measurable link between the structural state of microtubules and how easily consciousness can be switched off. Critics have offered more conventional explanations for the same result, however, pointing out that microtubules play essential roles in ordinary cellular processes throughout neurons, including transporting receptor proteins to the right locations on the cell surface, completely independent of any quantum mechanism. If stabilizing microtubules changes how efficiently a neuron manages its ordinary, classical, receptor-based machinery, that alone could plausibly shift anesthetic sensitivity without requiring any quantum explanation at all. This is a real, unresolved scientific disagreement, and honestly, it hasn't been definitively settled either way by the current evidence. Both interpretations remain live possibilities in the published literature. So where does this leave us at this point in the story? I think it's worth being completely honest about the shape of the evidence, rather than picking a side and pretending the picture is cleaner than it is. On one hand, the strongest, most mathematically rigorous objection to Orch-OR, Tegmark's decoherence calculation, has never been overturned in a way that satisfies the broader physics community. The overwhelming mainstream position remains that sustained, functionally relevant quantum coherence inside microtubules for the timescales Orch-OR requires is extraordinarily difficult to reconcile with known thermal physics. On the other hand, the general, sweeping argument that biology can never sustain relevant quantum coherence under warm physiological conditions has been meaningfully weakened by legitimate, replicated research in photosynthesis and other quantum biology systems. And a small, persistent group of researchers, not a large fraction of neuroscience or physics, but a real, published, peer-reviewed minority, continue to find electronic and pharmacological findings in microtubules, specifically that they argue are at least consistent with, even if they don't prove, some version of the Orch-OR picture. Most working neuroscientists, when asked directly, will tell you they don't think quantum mechanics is necessary to explain consciousness at all, and that classical theories built on how information gets integrated and made globally available across networks of neurons using entirely ordinary electrochemical signaling, are doing perfectly well without invoking anything as exotic as quantum gravity. We're going to spend real time with those classical alternatives shortly, because understanding them properly is the only way to fairly judge whether Orch-OR is solving a problem that classical neuroscience genuinely can't solve on its own, or whether it's proposing an elaborate, physically strained solution to a problem that may not require one. But before we get there, I want to take you somewhere else entirely, away from microtubules and decoherence calculations, and into the deeper, stranger question sitting underneath this whole debate. It's a question that predates quantum mechanics entirely, one that thinkers were already circling more than a century before Penrose and Hameroff ever met. It's the question of what role, if any, an observer plays in bringing reality itself into a definite state. And it's where quantum consciousness theory brushes up against something even physicists who reject Orch-OR outright still find themselves unable to fully explain. We'll go there next. So, where does this debate actually stand today, heading into 2026, after more than 3 decades of argument, calculation, and experiment? I think the honest answer is further along than when Penrose and Hameroff first published, in the sense that we now know a great deal more about quantum effects in biological systems generally, and about the specific electronic properties of microtubules in isolation, but not meaningfully closer to a resolution on the central question the theory was built to answer. Nobody has demonstrated, in a living, intact human brain, functionally relevant quantum coherence lasting anywhere near the timescales Orch-OR requires. And nobody has produced a classical theory of consciousness, including the 2 serious, well-developed ones we just walked through. That fully closes the explanatory gap between physical process and subjective experience either. Both sides of this argument are, in their own ways, still incomplete. What has changed, and changed significantly, is the sophistication of the tools available to actually test parts of this question, rather than simply argue about it in the abstract. This matters, because a theory that can't in principle be tested against evidence isn't really doing scientific work at all, no matter how mathematically elegant it is. To its credit, and this is something worth acknowledging fairly, Orch-OR has always made itself testable, even where the tests have been difficult to run and the results have been genuinely contested. One active area of research involves looking for what are sometimes called quantum biological signatures, subtle statistical patterns in how biological systems behave that would be very difficult to explain using purely classical physics, but that would naturally emerge if genuine quantum coherence were present and functionally relevant. This is a well-established experimental strategy in quantum biology more broadly. It's essentially how the photosynthesis research we discussed earlier built its case by identifying oscillating interference patterns in energy transfer that are a specific, recognizable fingerprint of coherent quantum behavior, not something a simple, classical hopping model would produce. Applying that same rigorous approach directly inside a living, functioning human brain is enormously more difficult than studying an isolated photosynthetic protein complex in a controlled lab dish, for reasons that are worth understanding rather than glossing over. A living brain is an almost unimaginably complex, constantly active electrochemical system, and isolating a genuine quantum signal, if one exists at all, from the overwhelming amount of ordinary classical electrical noise the brain generates every second is an extraordinarily difficult measurement problem at the very edge of what current instrumentation can achieve non-invasively. This is not a matter of researchers being unwilling to look. It's a matter of the signal, if it exists, being genuinely difficult to detect with the tools currently available and difficult to attribute unambiguously to a quantum mechanism rather than some more mundane classical explanation, even when something unusual is measured. This difficulty cuts in an important direction that's worth being honest about. The absence of confirmed evidence for quantum effects in a living brain is not the same thing as evidence against them. It genuinely could mean the effect isn't there. It could also mean our measurement tools simply haven't been sensitive or precise enough yet to detect something real, if it exists, buried underneath an overwhelming amount of ordinary neural noise. Distinguishing between those two possibilities is exactly the kind of open, unresolved scientific problem that responsible science communication should present as open, rather than quietly resolving it one way or the other for the sake of a tidier story. It's also worth being fair to the skeptical mainstream position here, because that position has real, substantial evidence behind it too, not just theoretical objections. Classical neuroscience, using entirely conventional tools, EEG, fMRI, careful behavioral and clinical studies has made genuine, measurable, accumulating progress on real aspects of consciousness over the past few decades. Researchers can now identify, with meaningful and clinically useful accuracy, differences in brain activity between conscious and unconscious patients, which has real, direct value in medical settings involving patients with severe brain injuries or disorders of consciousness. A domain where getting the science right isn't an academic exercise, but something that genuinely affects real medical and family decisions. None of this progress required invoking quantum mechanics in any form. That's a real point in favor of the classical research program, and it deserves to be weighed honestly alongside everything else we've discussed tonight. Not dismissed just because it's less dramatic than a theory involving quantum gravity and consciousness. So here, honestly, is where I think this leaves us after everything we've walked through together tonight. The hard problem of consciousness, the question of why physical processes in the brain are accompanied by subjective experience at all rather than happening in the dark, the way they seem to inside a computer running the most sophisticated software imaginable remains genuinely unsolved. Not unsolved in the sense that scientists haven't gotten around to it yet. The way an unsolved but ultimately routine math problem might simply be waiting for the right insight. Unsolved in the deeper sense that we don't yet have a framework, quantum or classical, that fully bridges the gap between physical description and felt experience, even after a century of extraordinary progress on nearly every other question science has taken on. Quantum consciousness theory, and Orch-OR specifically, represents one serious, genuinely creative, but also genuinely disputed attempt to close that gap. Built by a Nobel Prize-winning physicist and a physician who spent his career watching consciousness disappear and return in real patients. It faces a real, specific, mathematically grounded objection about decoherence that has never been fully overturned to the satisfaction of the broader physics community. It has also, to its credit, motivated real experimental work, inspired the broader and increasingly well-established field of quantum biology, and it continues to generate testable predictions that researchers are still actively investigating today, rather than simply retreating into pure philosophical argument. Classical theories of consciousness, meanwhile, rest on much firmer physical footing, and they've produced real, useful, clinically relevant scientific progress using nothing more exotic than the ordinary physics of electrons moving through neurons. But they have not yet explained, to the satisfaction of many serious philosophers and scientists working in this space, why any of that integration and broadcasting should be accompanied by subjective experience at all, rather than simply being very sophisticated computation happening, as far as anyone can currently demonstrate, in the dark. I don't think the honest ending to this story is a verdict, delivered with confidence in either direction, because I don't think the evidence, as it currently stands, actually supports one. I think the honest ending is a genuine open question, sitting exactly where Penrose and Hameroff, Tegmark, Chalmers, Tononi, and a great many other serious researchers have all, in their own very different ways, left it. What I find myself thinking about most, having spent this much time with the argument on both sides, isn't really the physics at all, as fascinating as it's been to walk through carefully together. It's something a little simpler, and maybe a little stranger underneath all of it. Somewhere behind your eyes, right now, atoms that are individually governed by the same quantum mechanical laws we've spent the last 2 hours exploring. Atoms with no experience, no awareness, nothing it is like to be a single carbon or oxygen atom sitting quietly in a neuron, have somehow organized themselves into something that is currently reading these words, following an argument, forming a private felt reaction to it that belongs entirely and only to you. However that happens, through quantum coherence in microtubules, through the classical integration of information across cortical networks, or through some mechanism nobody has proposed yet, sitting undiscovered somewhere ahead of us in the future of science, the fact that it happens at all remains, even after a century of extraordinary scientific progress on nearly everything else. One of the strangest and least explained facts in the entire universe. That's genuinely worth sitting with tonight, as you let all of this settle. Not the certainty of an answer, because there genuinely isn't one yet on either side of this debate. Just the honest, open shape of one of the most fascinating unanswered questions we have. Let's leave the brain behind for a moment and go somewhere smaller, stranger, and, in its own way, even more astonishing. The compass sense of a European robin. Every autumn, small songbirds like the European robin undertake migrations of hundreds or thousands of miles, navigating with an accuracy that would be impressive for a GPS-equipped aircraft, let alone a creature weighing about as much as a few sheets of paper. For a long time, biologists assumed birds relied entirely on conventional cues. The position of the sun, the stars, familiar landmarks, perhaps an ordinary magnetic sensor similar in principle to a compass needle, made of tiny iron-based particles somewhere in the body. That kind of magnetoreception, using small magnetic particles, is real and does exist in some organisms. But research into bird navigation over the past 2 decades has pointed to something considerably stranger sitting alongside it. And this is one of the best documented, most widely accepted findings in the entire field of quantum biology. The leading hypothesis, developed substantially by biophysicist Thorsten Ritz and colleagues, and built on earlier theoretical work by chemist Klaus Schulten, centers on a light-sensitive protein called cryptochrome, found in the retinas of migratory birds. When light strikes cryptochrome, it can trigger a chemical reaction that produces a pair of molecules called radicals, each carrying an unpaired electron. Those 2 electrons can become quantum mechanically entangled with each other, and their combined quantum spin state, whether they're aligned in a way physicists call a singlet or triplet state, is measurably sensitive to the direction and strength of the surrounding magnetic field, including a field as weak as the Earth's own magnetic field. Because the ratio between these 2 spin states influences the chemical products the reaction ultimately generates, and because that chemical outcome can in principle be linked to a detectable signal in the bird's visual system, the Earth's magnetic field could, through this mechanism, quite literally become part of what a bird sees. This is called the radical pair mechanism, and unlike Orch-OR, it has substantial, published, replicated experimental support behind it. Researchers have shown, in carefully controlled behavioral experiments, that migratory birds' ability to orient using magnetic cues can be disrupted by extremely weak, oscillating radio frequency magnetic fields. Fields far too weak to affect any classical, iron particle-based compass mechanism, but exactly the kind of field that would be expected to disrupt a quantum radical pair system if that system were real and functioning. This kind of result is very difficult to explain using purely classical chemistry, and it's one of the reasons quantum biology has moved, over the past 15 years or so, from a fringe curiosity to a genuinely respected subfield within biophysics. It's worth being precise about what this does and doesn't establish, the same way we were careful with the photosynthesis research earlier. The radical pair mechanism involves a relatively small, specific molecular system, 2 electrons in a single protein entangled for a comparatively short but functionally sufficient window of time, doing one very specific job. It's a genuine, hard-won example of quantum mechanics playing a real, functional, evolutionarily useful role inside a living organism under close to physiological conditions. But it is, once again, a completely different physical system, at a completely different scale of complexity, doing a completely different job than what Orch-OR proposes is happening across networks of microtubules throughout an entire human brain. The existence of one confirmed, functional quantum effect in biology doesn't automatically license belief in every other proposed one. Each claim still has to earn its own evidence, on its own terms, and bird magnetoreception has done that work far more thoroughly than Orch-OR has, at least so far. There's a second, more contested example worth mentioning honestly, precisely because it illustrates how quantum biology claims can range from well-supported to genuinely uncertain, even within legitimate scientific discussion. It's sometimes called the quantum theory of olfaction or vibrational theory of smell, developed primarily by biophysicist Luca Turin. The conventional explanation for how we distinguish different smells is a shape theory, that odor receptors in your nose recognize molecules based on their physical shape, somewhat like a lock and key. Turin proposed an alternative, that our olfactory receptors might instead detect the specific vibrational frequencies of chemical bonds within odor molecules using a quantum mechanism called inelastic electron tunneling, where an electron moving through the receptor loses a very specific amount of energy that depends on the molecule's particular vibrational signature, rather than only its physical shape. This remains a genuinely disputed hypothesis within olfactory science, and it's fair to present it that way rather than as settled fact in either direction. Some experimental evidence has been offered in its support, including studies in which humans or fruit flies were reportedly able to distinguish between molecules with very similar shapes but different vibrational properties, in ways shape theory alone would struggle to explain. But other researchers have published studies that failed to replicate some of these findings, and the shape-based theory of smell remains the dominant, mainstream explanation within the field. This is exactly the kind of live, ongoing, unresolved scientific disagreement worth knowing about honestly, rather than presenting either side as though it has already won. What all three of these cases together, photosynthesis, bird navigation, and the more contested case of smell, tell us is something genuinely important for how we should think about the Orch-OR debate specifically. Quantum biology as a field is no longer a fringe idea. It has real, hard-won, peer-reviewed successes, at least in the case of photosynthetic energy transfer and avian magnetoreception, which are about as well established as findings in this kind of frontier research get. That means the mere idea of quantum mechanics playing some functional role inside a living organism is not, by itself, something serious scientists dismiss out of hand anymore. The era in which you could reject any biological quantum theory purely on the grounds that warm biology can't do that is genuinely over. But it also means something the other direction, which is just as important to hold on to honestly. Each of these confirmed cases involved small, specific molecular systems, evolutionarily optimized over enormous timescales for one narrow function, operating for comparatively short but sufficient windows of coherence in structures considerably simpler and more isolated than the tangled, densely interconnected, constantly firing architecture of a living human brain. None of them, on their own or even taken together, closes the specific, well-documented gap Tegmark identified between the timescales microtubules could plausibly sustain coherence and the much longer timescales Orch-OR actually needs. Quantum biology has earned the right to be taken seriously as a field. It has not, so far, extended that credibility specifically to Orch-OR's claims about consciousness, however much its general success has softened the ground the theory has to stand on. Which brings us, I think, to a genuinely fascinating fork in the road, one that takes us out of physics almost entirely and into philosophy, because there's a completely different way serious thinkers have tried to solve the hard problem. One that doesn't need quantum mechanics, doesn't need microtubules, and doesn't need Tegmark's calculation to be wrong at all. It solves the problem, if it solves it, by refusing to accept one of the assumptions almost everyone in this debate, Orch-OR proponents and classical neuroscientists alike, has been quietly making all along. That consciousness is something rare, produced only by unusually complex systems like brains. That idea is called Panpsychism, and it's had a much stranger, longer, and more respectable history in serious philosophy than most people assume. We'll go there next. Panpsychism sounds, at first, like the kind of idea that belongs firmly outside serious science. The notion that consciousness, in some very minimal form, might be a basic, fundamental feature of physical reality itself, present in some small way, not just in brains, but in every particle of matter in the universe. It's easy to hear that and picture something closer to mysticism than philosophy of mind. But it's worth knowing, honestly, that some version of this idea has been taken seriously by genuinely rigorous thinkers across the history of both philosophy and physics, including some names we've already spent real time with tonight. It's not a fringe position invented by wellness culture. It's a minority position within academic philosophy of mind, but a real and actively defended one, with serious contemporary proponents publishing in mainstream philosophy journals. To understand why anyone serious would consider it, it helps to go back to the hard problem itself and notice something about the structure of the argument we've been building all night. Every theory we've discussed so far, Orch-OR, integrated information theory, global workspace theory, shares one assumption in common. They all treat consciousness as something that emerges at some point out of matter that is not, by itself, conscious at all. Individual neurons on this shared assumption are not conscious. Individual atoms certainly aren't. Consciousness, on this view, is something new that shows up only once matter gets organized in a sufficiently complex, sufficiently integrated way. A genuine emergent property, the way liquidity emerges from a large enough collection of water molecules, even though no single water molecule is itself liquid. Philosopher Galen Strawson, among others, has argued that this kind of emergence is actually much stranger and much harder to justify than it first appears once you look closely at it. We have good physical explanations for why liquidity emerges from water molecules. It comes down to intermolecular forces and statistical mechanics, concepts that are, in principle, fully derivable from the properties those molecules already have. But we don't have anything remotely similar for consciousness. Nobody has ever shown, even in principle, how you get from purely non-experiential ingredients, mass, charge, spin, position, to something that has a subjective, felt quality, no matter how those ingredients get arranged or how complex the arrangement becomes. On this view, that isn't a temporary gap in our current knowledge, waiting for a cleverer theory to fill it in. It's a suspicious sign that maybe the starting assumption is wrong. Maybe experience doesn't emerge from non-experiential matter at all, because nothing genuinely non-experiential can, even in principle, add up to something experiential, no matter how it's arranged. Panpsychism offers an alternative starting point. Instead of asking how consciousness could emerge from fundamentally non-conscious matter, it proposes that some extremely minimal form of experience might be a basic, ground floor property of physical reality itself. Something present in some vanishingly simple form in every fundamental particle, alongside more familiar physical properties like mass and charge. On this view, the felt redness you experience when you look at a tomato isn't something that magically appears out of nowhere once neurons get sufficiently complex. It's something built up, combined, and enormously amplified from much simpler forms of experience that were, in some minimal sense, already present in the matter making up your brain all along. I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the point where casual online content about panpsychism tends to slide into claims that don't actually hold up. And it's worth correcting a common misunderstanding directly. Serious panpsychist philosophers are not claiming that individual electrons think, or have beliefs, or experience anything remotely like human consciousness. The experience they're proposing at the fundamental level is meant to be almost unimaginably minimal. Nothing like thought, memory, or self-awareness, just the barest possible flicker of something it is like, if that phrase even applies at that scale in any meaningful sense at all. Philosopher Philip Goff, one of panpsychism's most prominent contemporary defenders, has been explicit and careful about this distinction in his published work. This is not a claim that particles are intelligent or aware in any everyday sense of those words. It's a much narrower, more technical metaphysical claim about where basic experience might sit in the fundamental structure of physical reality. Panpsychism also faces its own serious, well-known unsolved problem, and I think it's important to give it exactly as much scrutiny as we've given every other theory tonight, rather than treating it as an easy escape hatch from the hard problem. It's called the combination problem, and it was identified clearly by the philosopher William James as far back as the 1890s, long before quantum mechanics or modern neuroscience existed at all. If simple forms of experience really are present at the level of individual particles, how exactly do billions of these separate, tiny individual experiences combine together into the single, unified, coherent experience you're having right now? Reading these words as one continuous, integrated stream of awareness, rather than remaining billions of separate, disconnected flickers of micro experience that never actually merge into anything resembling a unified mind at all. This is not a minor detail panpsychists have simply overlooked. It's widely considered the single biggest unresolved challenge facing the entire framework, and serious proponents openly acknowledge it as such in their published work, rather than glossing over it. Nobody, including philosophers who find panpsychism compelling on other grounds, has produced a fully satisfying answer to how combination is actually supposed to work. Some, including Goff, have proposed complex, carefully worked out variations designed to address it. But none of these proposed solutions currently commands anything close to consensus, even among philosophers who are otherwise sympathetic to the broader panpsychist project. Now, and this is the part of tonight's story where two very different threads we've already spent real time on actually meet each other directly, which I think is genuinely one of the more interesting connections in this whole area. Some Orch-OR proponents, including Hameroff himself in later writing, have explicitly connected Orch-OR to panpsychism, proposing that Penrose's objective reduction events, those moments where a quantum superposition spontaneously resolves into a definite state, might themselves be the fundamental, universe-wide mechanism through which basic experience enters physical reality in the first place, with orchestrated microtubule networks in brains simply providing an unusually complex, evolutionarily refined structure for organizing and amplifying something that, on this view, is already happening. In some far simpler form, throughout the rest of the universe, everywhere quantum collapses occur at all. This connection is worth understanding clearly, but it's also worth being precise about its actual scientific status, rather than letting the two ideas blur together into something that sounds more established than it is. It represents philosophical speculation, layered on top of an already disputed physical theory, not a separate line of independent evidence supporting either one. If Tegmark's decoherence objection to Orch-OR holds, and as we discussed, the majority of the physics community still believes it does, then this particular version of panpsychism, built specifically on Penrose's objective reduction mechanism, loses its proposed physical foundation entirely, regardless of how philosophically interesting the broader panpsychist framework remains on entirely separate grounds. Conversely, someone can find general panpsychism philosophically compelling as a solution to the hard problem while considering Orch-OR's specific microtubule mechanism scientifically unconvincing. These are genuinely separable positions, and serious philosophers hold views across all four possible combinations of accepting or rejecting each one independently, without any real contradiction. I think what's genuinely valuable about walking through panpsychism carefully, the way we just have, isn't that it resolves anything Orch-OR left unresolved for us tonight. It's that it demonstrates something important about the actual shape of this debate that's easy to lose sight of when quantum consciousness theory gets treated, in most popular coverage, as a simple two-sided argument between quantum mystics on one side and hard-nosed classical scientists on the other. The real philosophical landscape here is considerably richer, stranger, and more genuinely contested than that. Serious, credentialed thinkers, working from entirely different starting assumptions and completely different lines of argument, keep independently arriving at some version of the conclusion that consciousness might require rethinking something fundamental about how we currently understand the basic structure of physical reality. Not because they're eager to embrace something mystical, but because the alternative, standard assumption that experience simply emerges for free once ordinary matter gets sufficiently complicated has never actually been demonstrated to work by anyone using any framework, even after a century of trying. That thought is going to lead us somewhere I think you'll find genuinely engaging. What does any of this actually mean for free will? If your brain, at some level, really does depend on quantum indeterminacy, whether through Orch-OR specifically or through ordinary quantum randomness present in any physical system, does that rescue the possibility of genuine free choice from the grip of strict physical determinism? Or does it just replace one kind of determinism with a different kind of randomness, neither of which sounds much like what we actually mean when we talk about making a free decision? That's exactly where we're headed next. Here's a question that sounds simple until you actually try to answer it carefully. When you decided a few minutes ago to keep watching this instead of closing the tab, was that choice really yours in some meaningful sense? Or was it simply the inevitable output of prior physical causes, stretching back through your brain chemistry, your upbringing, the position of every atom in your body, all the way to the Big Bang, with no more genuine freedom in it than a rock has when it rolls downhill? This is the problem of free will, and it's one of the oldest, most argued over questions in all of philosophy. But it's worth spending real time on tonight specifically, because quantum consciousness theory gets invoked constantly, often carelessly, as though it obviously rescues free will from this problem. I want to walk through that claim carefully, because when you actually look closely at it, the picture turns out to be a great deal more complicated and a great deal more interesting than the quick version usually presented. Let's start with why free will felt threatened in the first place. Classical physics, the physics of Newton, describes a universe that is, in principle, fully deterministic. If you knew the precise position and momentum of every particle in the universe at one moment, and you knew all the laws governing how those particles interact, you could, in principle, calculate the exact state of the universe at any future moment, down to the smallest detail. Every atom in your brain, every decision you'll ever make, already fixed by the initial conditions and the unchanging laws governing how those conditions evolve. This idea is sometimes called Laplace's demon, after the mathematician Pierre-Simon Laplace, who described this hypothetical calculating intelligence explicitly in 1814. If classical physics is complete and correct, there's a real philosophical case to be made that everything you'll ever think, want, or do was already, in some sense, determined the instant the universe began. And the feeling that you're freely choosing anything at all is, on this view, simply what determinism feels like from the inside. This is genuinely unsettling to sit with, honestly, and it's exactly the discomfort that leads people toward quantum mechanics for a way out. Because quantum mechanics, unlike classical physics, is not fully deterministic in the same way. As we discussed earlier tonight, before measurement, a quantum system exists in a superposition of possible states, and which specific outcome actually occurs upon measurement appears to be, as far as every experiment ever conducted can tell us, genuinely random, not merely unpredictable because we lack enough information, the way a coin flip is technically deterministic if you knew every physical detail of the flip, but fundamentally, irreducibly probabilistic in a way built into the actual mathematical structure of quantum theory itself. This is one of the most well-confirmed and genuinely strange features of quantum mechanics, and it holds up under every experimental test we've ever devised. So the reasoning goes like this. If quantum randomness plays some meaningful role inside the brain, whether through Orch-OR specifically, or simply through the ordinary quantum randomness that, at some level, exists in any physical system made of atoms, then your decisions aren't fully determined by prior causes after all. There's a genuine element of open, unpredictable randomness woven into the physical processes generating your thoughts and choices. Doesn't that rescue free will? Here's where I think it's important to slow down, because this is a case where a large number of serious philosophers, including many who take quantum consciousness theory seriously on other grounds, think this particular argument doesn't actually work, and their reasoning is worth understanding rather than glossing over. The problem is this: genuine randomness isn't the same thing as freedom, and swapping strict determinism for quantum randomness doesn't obviously get you anything philosophically better. Think about what it would actually mean for your decisions to be partly the product of quantum randomness occurring somewhere in your neurons. If a quantum coin flip, in some sense, tips the balance toward one choice rather than another, in what meaningful way is that choice now more genuinely yours than it was under strict determinism? A decision caused by pure chance doesn't feel any more like an expression of your will, your values, or your reasoning than a decision that was fully predetermined by prior physical causes. If anything, it can feel less like genuine agency. A coin flip happening inside your skull isn't obviously a better candidate for free will than a fully determined chain of cause and effect. Philosophers sometimes call this the luck objection to libertarian free will, and it's one of the most durable, widely discussed problems in the entire free will literature. Discussed at length by philosophers across a very wide range of positions on this question, including thinkers who don't agree about much else. This is exactly the objection that physicist Henry Stapp, working from an entirely different theoretical framework than Orch-OR, tried to address directly in his own writing on quantum mechanics and free will. Stapp argued, across several published works, that quantum indeterminacy alone isn't enough to produce meaningful free will. What's needed, on his view, is some additional mechanism by which a conscious agent actively selects among the genuinely open quantum possibilities available at a given moment, rather than simply having one option among many occur at random. Stapp drew on the mathematical framework von Neumann developed for quantum measurement, and proposed that conscious attention itself might function as the mechanism that selects among quantum possibilities in a way that goes beyond pure randomness without collapsing back into strict determinism either. I want to be clear that Stapp's specific proposal remains a minority position within physics, genuinely contested by other physicists working on quantum foundations, and it hasn't achieved anything close to consensus acceptance. But it illustrates something important and worth understanding. Simply pointing to quantum randomness in the brain doesn't, by itself, solve the free will problem. You need some further additional story about how randomness becomes genuine, meaningful choice, rather than simply becoming a different, equally unsatisfying kind of accident. There's a completely different, and in some ways more influential, response to all of this within contemporary philosophy. And it's worth presenting fairly alongside the libertarian, quantum-based approach, because it represents where a very large share of professional philosophers actually land on this question. It's called compatibilism, and its core claim is that this entire framing, free will requiring some kind of escape from physical causation, whether through classical determinism or quantum indeterminacy, is, from the start, asking the wrong question. Compatibilists, a position with historical roots going back to philosophers like David Hume, and defended by many leading contemporary philosophers, including Daniel Dennett, argue that what we actually mean and actually care about when we talk about free will has nothing to do with whether your choices were physically caused. It has to do with whether your choices flow from your own reasoning, your own values, your own considered deliberation, rather than being externally coerced, compelled by mental illness beyond your control, or forced on you against your will by some outside power. On this view, a choice can be both fully caused by prior physical events, whether deterministically or with some quantum randomness mixed in, It genuinely doesn't matter either way, and completely free, in the only sense of freedom that actually matters for ordinary human life, morality, and responsibility. I find this a genuinely useful and clarifying way to end this particular thread of tonight's exploration, because it shows something worth sitting with honestly. Quantum consciousness theory, even if every claim Penrose and Hameroff have made turned out to be completely correct, wouldn't automatically hand us the kind of free will many people instinctively hope quantum mechanics might provide. The philosophical work of actually defining and defending free will has to be done separately, carefully, on its own terms, regardless of which underlying physics, classical or quantum, turns out to describe the brain correctly. The physics question and the free will question, as fascinating as they are together, turn out to be far more independent of each other than they first appear. Which brings us to a question that takes this entire conversation somewhere genuinely current, somewhere being actively debated in AI labs and philosophy departments alike, right now in 2026. If consciousness really does depend on some specific physical mechanism, quantum coherence in biological microtubules, in Orch-OR's telling, or a particular kind of classical information integration, according to the alternatives we discussed earlier, what does that mean for machines? Could an artificial system built from silicon rather than biological neurons ever actually be conscious? Or is there something about being made of living biological tissue specifically that consciousness, whatever its ultimate mechanism turns out to be, simply requires? That's exactly where we're headed next. In the summer of 2022, a Google engineer named Blake Lemoine made headlines around the world for claiming that one of the company's AI language models had become sentient, based on the sophistication and emotional apparent depth of conversations he'd had with it. Google disagreed publicly and firmly. Lemoine was placed on leave and later left the company, and the overwhelming consensus among AI researchers at the time was that he had, in effect, been fooled by a very sophisticated pattern matching system into perceiving genuine inner experience where none actually existed. I bring this up not to relitigate that particular controversy, but because it's a genuinely useful, concrete entry point into a question that has only become more urgent since, as language models have grown dramatically more fluent, more capable, and more convincingly conversational with each passing year. In the summer of 2022, a Google engineer named Blake Lemoine made headlines around the world for claiming that one of the company's AI language models had become sentient, based on the sophistication and emotional apparent depth of conversations he'd had with it. Google disagreed publicly and firmly. Lemoine was placed on leave and later left the company, and the overwhelming consensus among AI researchers at the time was that he had, in effect, been fooled by a very sophisticated pattern matching system into perceiving genuine inner experience where none actually existed. I bring this up not to relitigate that particular controversy, but because it's a genuinely useful, concrete entry point into a question that has only become more urgent since, as language models have grown dramatically more fluent, more capable, and more convincingly conversational with each passing year. Could a machine ever actually be conscious? And if it could, how would we possibly know? This question turns out to connect directly and substantively to everything we've spent tonight exploring, because your answer to it depends enormously on which theory of consciousness you find most convincing. Different frameworks give genuinely, sharply different answers here, and walking through them carefully tells us something important about what's actually at stake in this whole debate. Something with real, near-term consequences, not just abstract philosophical interest. Let's start with what philosophers call functionalism, which has historically been one of the dominant positions in philosophy of mind, particularly influential from the 1960s onward through the work of philosophers like Hilary Putnam and Jerry Fodor. Functionalism holds that mental states are defined entirely by the functional role they play, by what they do, what causes them, and what effects they produce, rather than by the specific physical material they happen to be made of. On a strict functionalist view, if you could build a system out of absolutely any material, silicon included, that reproduced the same functional organization as a human brain, the same patterns of information processing, input, and output, however it happened to be physically implemented, there would be no principled reason to say that system couldn't be conscious. Consciousness, on this view, is fundamentally about pattern and organization, not about the specific biological substrate carrying out that pattern. This is a real, historically influential, and still actively defended position within philosophy of mind, and it directly implies that a sufficiently sophisticated artificial intelligence, in principle, could genuinely be conscious, given the right kind of internal organization, regardless of what it's physically built from. Integrated information theory, which we discussed earlier tonight, leads to a genuinely interesting and less commonly appreciated variation on this question. Because IIT ties consciousness specifically to a system's mathematically calculated degree of integration rather than to what it's made of, it does not automatically rule out machine consciousness on principle, but it makes a much stronger, more specific, and considerably more restrictive claim than simple functionalism does. IIT holds that consciousness depends on the actual physical structure and connectivity of a system generating that integration, not merely on whether the system produces the correct outputs. This has a real, concrete, and somewhat surprising consequence. According to IIT, a computer simulation of a conscious brain, even one that reproduced every single input and output with perfect atom-for-atom accuracy, would not necessarily itself be conscious if the underlying physical hardware running that simulation lacked the specific kind of integrated causal structure IIT's mathematics requires. Most conventional computer architectures today, built around a single central processor rapidly executing sequential instructions one after another, tend to have relatively low calculated integration in IIT's specific technical sense, even when they're producing extraordinarily sophisticated human-like outputs. Giulio Tononi himself has argued, directly and explicitly in his published work, that this is a real, substantive difference between his theory and simple functionalism. Not a minor technical footnote, it's precisely why IIT predicts that a large language model, however fluent and convincing its conversation becomes, might produce all the right words about having experiences while having no actual experience whatsoever behind them, simply because of how that system's underlying hardware is physically structured, independent of how sophisticated its outputs appear from the outside. Global workspace theory occupies an interesting middle position worth understanding on its own terms. Since it emphasizes the functional broadcasting of information across a system, rather than any strict requirement about specific biological material, it's generally considered more open than IIT to the possibility of machine consciousness, in principle. But its own proponents, including Stanislas Dehaene, have been notably cautious in their public statements about whether current AI systems actually implement anything resembling genuine global broadcasting in the specific sense the theory requires, as opposed to producing human-like outputs through an entirely different kind of underlying computational process, one that might resemble global broadcasting in its results without genuinely resembling it in its actual internal mechanism. Interestingly, and worth understanding as a real point of contrast with the other theories we've discussed, takes what is probably the single most restrictive position of all on this specific question. Because the theory ties consciousness specifically to quantum gravitational effects occurring within the particular biological structure of microtubules. Hameroff has argued directly and explicitly in multiple published and public statements that conventional silicon-based computers, built from entirely different physical materials with an entirely different underlying structure, could not become conscious using current architectures, no matter how sophisticated their software or how convincingly human-like their outputs became. This is sometimes described as a form of biological naturalism about consciousness, The view, argued at length, and from a different angle by philosopher John Searle as well, that consciousness is specifically a biological phenomenon, produced by particular kinds of physical, causal processes that happen to occur in brains, and that simply is not reproducible by any system built from fundamentally different physical materials and processes, no matter how functionally similar its outward behavior might become. For our final stretch, I want to bring this back down from silicon and abstraction to something far more direct and personal. Your own mind in altered states. What does the actual research say about meditation and about the class of substances known as psychedelics and their genuinely documented effects on conscious experience? And after everything we've walked through together tonight, the physics, the philosophy, the genuine uncertainty sitting at the bottom of nearly every theory we've examined, what's actually left, honestly, once all of it settles? That's where we'll close. Let's talk honestly about meditation and psychedelics, because this is another area where popular science content tends to drift quickly from real, replicated findings into much larger claims than the actual research supports. And given everything we've been careful about all night, it's worth holding that same standard here too. Meditation research has genuinely matured a great deal over the past 2 decades, moving from a fairly marginal topic within neuroscience to a well-funded, seriously studied area with real, replicated findings using conventional tools like EEG and fMRI, no quantum mechanics required to explain any of what's actually been found so far. Researchers, including Richard Davidson at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, have published extensively on how sustained meditation practice is associated with measurable changes in brain activity, particularly increased gamma wave synchronization, high-frequency neural oscillations across widely separated brain regions, especially in long-term practitioners with tens of thousands of hours of accumulated meditation experience. This kind of long-range neural synchronization is a real, well-documented, and genuinely interesting finding. It's worth being precise about what this actually shows, though, because long-range neural synchronization and quantum entanglement across brain regions are two entirely different physical phenomena, even though popular content sometimes blurs them together as though they're the same discovery. The gamma synchronization researchers have measured is a classical electrical phenomenon, different brain regions firing in coordinated rhythmic patterns, detectable using perfectly ordinary EEG electrodes placed on the scalp, explainable using conventional neural circuitry, and nothing more exotic than that. It's a real and fascinating finding about how sustained meditation practice appears to reshape functional brain connectivity over time. It is not, on its own, evidence of quantum coherence, and the researchers who conducted this work have generally been careful not to claim that it is. Psychedelic research has undergone an even more dramatic transformation in scientific respectability over the past 15 years or so, moving from a research area largely shut down since the early 1970s to one now being actively studied at major research universities, including Johns Hopkins, Imperial College London, and NYU, with serious funding and rigorous, peer-reviewed clinical trial designs. Researchers, including Robin Carhart Harris, have used brain imaging to study what happens during psilocybin experiences, and one of the genuinely striking, well-replicated findings involves something called the default mode network, a set of interconnected brain regions that tend to be highly active during ordinary, resting, self-referential thought, and that are believed to play a significant role in generating our everyday sense of a stable, continuous personal identity. Published research has consistently shown that psilocybin and other classic psychedelics tend to significantly reduce activity and connectivity within this default mode network, and that the degree of this reduction correlates in multiple studies with how strongly participants report experiencing a dissolved sense of personal boundary or ego during the experience itself. The kind of experience often described across a wide range of research subjects as a sense of interconnectedness or unity that goes beyond one's ordinary, everyday sense of being a separate, bounded self. This is genuinely interesting, replicated neuroscience, and it has led to real, serious clinical research into psilocybin assisted therapy for treatment resistant depression and end of life anxiety, with promising published results that have nothing to do with quantum mechanics at all, and everything to do with measurable classical changes in ordinary neural network activity. I want to draw a clear, honest line here, the same way we have all night. The finding that psychedelics reduce default mode network activity, and that this correlates with subjective reports of interconnectedness, is real, replicated science. The claim, sometimes made in less careful popular content, that this constitutes evidence for literal quantum entanglement between minds, or objective connection to some universal consciousness field, goes considerably beyond what any of this actual research has shown. The subjective feeling of interconnectedness is a real, measurable, psychologically and neurologically significant experience, worth taking seriously in its own right, precisely because of what it reveals about ordinary brain function, self-representation, and the surprisingly flexible, constructed nature of our everyday sense of self. Not because it constitutes direct evidence of literal, physical connection to anything outside your own skull. So here we are, near the very end of a long night together, having walked honestly through physics, biology, philosophy, and now the neuroscience of some of the most profound subjective experiences human beings ever report having. What actually can we honestly say we've learned? We started with a simple, stubborn fact. There is something it is like to be you. Reading these words, and nobody, not Penrose, not Hameroff, not Tegmark, not Tononi, not Dehaene, not Searle, not a single serious researcher working on any side of this question, has fully explained why. We looked at Orch-OR carefully and fairly, understanding both its genuine ambition and its real, specific, unresolved scientific problem with decoherence timescales. We looked at the classical alternatives and found that they too, however much firmer their physical footing, have not closed the explanatory gap either. We found real, replicated quantum effects in biology, in photosynthesis, in bird navigation, that meaningfully weakened one of the oldest blanket objections to any quantum theory of mind, without thereby rescuing Orch-OR's specific, unresolved claims about microtubules. We trace the deep, genuinely respectable history connecting quantum measurement to questions about observation and consciousness, long before Penrose and Hameroff ever met. We sat with panpsychism and its own serious unsolved combination problem. We asked what any of this means for free will, and found that the honest answer complicates the popular hope more than it resolves it. We asked whether machines could ever be conscious, and found that our best theories give us genuinely different, currently untestable answers to one of the most urgent practical questions of this exact moment in history. And now, sitting at the end of it all, I don't think the honest thing to offer you is a verdict. I said that once already tonight, a while back, and I meant it then, and I still mean it now, even more, having gone so much further into the argument together since. Anyone who tells you this question is settled, in either direction, quantum or classical, mystical or purely mechanical, is telling you something more confident than the actual evidence currently supports, no matter how certain they sound saying it. What I can offer you, honestly, is something I think is worth more than a false certainty anyway. You've now walked through one of the most genuinely contested, genuinely important open questions in the whole of science, carefully, fairly, with real names, real papers, real experiments, and real unresolved disagreements laid out honestly on every side, rather than flattened into a simple story with a comforting ending. That's rare in this particular corner of science communication, and I think you've earned the right to sit with real uncertainty tonight, rather than a manufactured answer. Somewhere behind your eyes right now, quietly, without any fanfare, matter that by every account should simply be processing information in the dark is instead doing something else entirely. It's being you, right now, in this exact moment, following this exact sentence, forming your own private, felt reaction to everything we've walked through together tonight. However that happens, whichever of these theories eventually turns out to be right, or whether the real answer is something nobody currently on either side of this debate has thought of yet, that fact alone remains one of the strangest, least explained, most genuinely remarkable things in the entire known universe. If you made it all the way here with me tonight, I'd genuinely like to know where you've landed, after everything. Not just which theory felt most convincing, but which specific piece of evidence, across everything we covered, actually moved you. And just as importantly, which argument on the other side gave you the most genuine pause? Tell me honesty. I read every one, and conversations built on that kind of honest disagreement are exactly the ones worth having. Sleep well.